hopefully. So we should be able to get this recorded. I mean, it is recording, and we should be able to post it. So we can go from there. But please feel free to share it to anybody that you know that wants to watch.
Okay, so without further ado, again, sorry for the delay. Thank you everyone for joining us. This is meeting number 2 of our work group, the Kentucky Wetland and Stream Fees in lieu of Mitigation FILO program. So I think, can everyone see the attendees and you know who else is joined us, so we don't have to, we can skip the roll call per se per person. But I appreciate everyone's time today and appreciate you joining us. Our agenda today, we're going to update you with a couple of items. Once we go through that, we will pass it off to Tim Baumgartner, who has graciously joined us from North Carolina as the former director of their Department of Mitigation Services. And he was an integral part in their becoming what they are today, and has been with them for a long time. So he has a lot of wonderful insight. So he's going to give us a presentation on their perspective. Scott and I will follow that up with how that translates to Kentucky FILO with some real specific examples, or at least the explanations of our processes and procedures. And then as a group, we'll go through objectives from this point, things that we'd like to do. So to start off with what I would like to give Commissioner Storm an opportunity to, if he would like to say anything like he did last time, any sort of departmental updates that might be beneficial to share, but if not, we can continue on. Commissioner Storm.
Thank you, Rob. I will just basically say thank you all for attending, and I hope today this is informative and beneficial to all. But for the sake of time, since we're off to such a late start, I'll just turn it back over to you all. And if anybody wants to reach out to me, rich.storm@ky.gov. Love to chat with you. Y'all take care, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, sir. A couple of updates. As I mentioned, Tim Baumgartner is going to be presenting with us, but we also have met with him. He was, like, again, very gracious, came up here and met with us in person so we could really dig in deep and make sure that we had as good a possible kind of a crash course on North Carolina's program and mitigation in that state. And he hopefully got a good dose of us as well, in all the right kind of good ways of learning. And we enjoyed a meal together, which was really nice.
It was a good comparison, contrast between North Carolina barbecue and Kentucky barbecue.
Yeah. Barbecue and mitigation. So that was really nice, though, and very, very informative. And so we're hoping to kind of pass that on to the work group today. Really will be our primary objective. In addition, just a quick update, we do have the full delivery RFP for the Upper Cumberland is out there. A solicitation. We will speak to that, but not in great detail, because I know there may be some interested people on the call that may be responding to that solicitation. So we don't want to get in the way of that, but certainly that is out there, and we've been through a round, or working through a significant round of question and answer with those vendors. So
our responses are due to the Finance Cabinet by the 22nd, which is Monday. So we're in the process of responding to the questions and getting those down to the Finance Cabinet for publication.
We're really excited about that and seeing how that goes forward. And then the last thing, I think some of you are aware, but in case you're not, which I mean I'm sure you are, really. There's no way you're not. But there's a lot of economic growth that everybody in Kentucky is excited about. Of course, the governor announced the Ford battery plant in Hardin County, and the federal infrastructure bill is coming through, and I know KYTC, our transportation department here in Kentucky, is pretty excited and ramping up to prepare for that as well. And we plan to be reaching out to them and hopefully get some heads up and make that part of our planning as well, so we can be there for them. So just a few updates. Scott, do you have anything lingering to add?
No, and just for everybody's, if you can, can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Can you show the service area where the Ford plant is going in is in the, was going to be the Green River, which is, Rob, do you want to point it out on the?
I don't know if I can see my pointer.
Okay. Which is right about there. So that's going in, and that's going in into the Green River service area. Do we have any anticipation of the total number of credits that they're going to need, or is that still in design?
It's hugely preliminary right now, but they were looking at kind of a 4 to 6 month outlook, and it was several dozens of thousands of stream credits. I'm not sure about wetland at this point. But none of those numbers are final, so I don't really, take all that with a grain of salt. But there's a big development, big opportunity for the economy, and also a big mitigation need, and right there in the middle of the state. So just to let everybody know.
And obviously, the federal infrastructure bill is based on some of the presentations Senator McConnell has done, is going to have some huge impact with money headed to Kentucky. So we're really excited to be working with Transportation Cabinet and helping where we can to help facilitate that, especially having driven across to Cincinnati. If you've done that real recently, hopefully that bridge is somewhere in the pecking order.
Yeah, definitely some need there. So again, we're really excited about all of these updates. And so I think without I'm going to pause my presentation and turn things over to Tim. Tim, would you like me to bring up your presentation and cycle through, or do you want to share your screen?
Let me see if I can share a screen, Rob.
All right, I'll stop and see what it says.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
How do I enable it?
You need to click that off.
I think
I got it now.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go. See, some of the tech stuff I can do.
All right, you seeing it now?
We see it here.
Okay, good deal. Trying to turn off my camera so I can save bandwidth. I reckon we'll roll with it. Good morning, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to present to the group. As Rob said, we did have a great meeting a few weeks ago up in Kentucky. Met with Scott and Rob and Mike, and we had a very good couple of days. Just a little bit about my background. I am the former director of Division of Mitigation Services. I was with Mitigation Services in North Carolina for 14 years. I was director for 5 of those years. And we did make a lot of changes during that 14-year time frame that I was at Mitigation Services that I'll go through a little bit today. A couple of things that I know us government folks get tied up with acronyms pretty hard. If I mentioned DMS, I'm talking about Division of Mitigation Services. And also, I know Kentucky goes by the term FILO. The federal rule uses the in lieu fee ILF acronym usually, so I may interchange those back and forth. So if I'm talking about in lieu fee, I'm talking about programs like DMS and FILO. So without further ado, a little bit about the Division of Mitigation Services. It is a program within the Department of Environmental Quality, is the environmental agency in North Carolina. It was established in 1997. I believe that Virginia is the only program that is about a year older than Mitigation Services. It was established then under the name of Wetland Restoration Program with the intent to provide an alternative for permittee responsible mitigation, basically a permittee that has to do its own mitigation. There was not any banks, or there were several banks trying to come online during that time. But as far as mitigation opportunities, pretty much permittee responsible or this option was the only option. As time went on, several years, DOT in North Carolina went through some very difficult times getting permits as a result of mitigation, and looked towards the program to do some of its mitigation, offsite mitigation for them. So the Ecosystem Enhancement Program was actually transformed from the Wetlands Restoration Program in 2003. And then the Division of Mitigation Services was created in 2015 as we were kind of making, it was a branding change as we were making a huge significant business model change in the division. I will say there's a couple of things that are unique to North Carolina. Well, one thing in particular is we have a very consistent high volume of mitigation and market in the state. We have a lot of impacts. We do a lot of coordination with our NCDOT to do advanced mitigation. So that does bring a high volume of mitigation that is available to do in the state. One thing that Rob and I talked about, and Scott, and that I've seen in a lot of different instances working with other in lieu fee programs across the country, is the focus of the business of mitigation with restoration objectives. It's a struggle that DMS honestly had from its inception, where we tried to focus so much on restoration that we didn't get the business of mitigation done. And I want to walk through a little bit of the history of DMS and where we came from. As it was transferring from Wetlands Restoration Program over to the Ecosystem Enhancement Program, in the early stages, there was a lot of pressure that, not dissimilar from what FILO is going through now, from media, from legislative sources and other places for the program to get that focus on getting mitigation on the ground and moving it through. The program, North Carolina program, was taking money in and was doing a lot of planning, trying to get mitigation focus where it needed to be. But the processes that we were using were slow and a little bit arduous. And we had a big focus of restoration over mitigation. And when these in lieu fee programs struggle a lot of times with that, trying to do the right thing in the right places, but there is the business side of it that has to get accomplished. We had a lot of meetings and discussions and agreements and handshakes and kissing babies and patting people on the back to try to get to the right place and the right position. But a lot of that was difficult. And because that as the program went on and it's focusing primarily on a design bid build model, which requires a ton of time, people, personnel, and honestly risk to the program. And while we were going through that process, it seemed to be exhausting for a lot of us, the regulators, the program, as well as the private industry. And the way that we actually change things is changing the business model on how the program actually worked. The biggest thing that DMS did was to refocus its efforts and basically let private industry put its money where its mouth is and go to either a release bank credit purchase or primarily a full delivery program procurement process within the program, and virtually eliminated any design bid build new projects that were coming online. Obviously, there was a lot that we had to get through the snake, if you will, and the DMS is still working on some of those, but the new projects coming online primarily focus on full delivery. And as you can see, about the shift was right around 2011 that a lot of those projects started dropping off, and we had a significant focus on basically letting the private industry produce and procure for the program mitigation credits. We found that it was much timelier, and it also averted a lot of risk for us as well. And one reason that I think this program has been successful over time is that we changed that procurement model system to get rid of some of the project risks that we were facing. You know, this full delivery performance-based contracting process we have in North Carolina really does focus on ecosystem function. A lot of our scoring and how we focus those projects really address that quote unquote restoration side of things. But we get a lot of these other ancillary benefits as well. We also have cost controls that when these projects come in, we know exactly what the costs are going to be going forward. And I'll talk a little bit about that in some other slides. But you can see kind of the volume that North Carolina has. We have a significant amount of mitigation volume in the state, probably more than any other, which is, you know, I know is a little bit different than what you're dealing with there in Kentucky. Here again, talking about the DMS procurement hierarchy, that our focus has been on these two items primarily, where we're looking very hard at full delivery. In all honesty, and you know, we talked with when we talked with FILO about it a little bit, there are complications when in lieu fees purchase bank credits. There's some, you know, checks and balances that have to occur, which sometimes are difficult for an in lieu fee to navigate, and that's just, you know, part of the process, either from the procurement side or from, you know, dealing between Corps of Engineers approval and the ILF purchase. So in comparison to, you know, the two programs, one big thing that North Carolina has going for it is that the Department of Transportation in North Carolina is its biggest customer. It's about 85% of its customer base. And a huge part of the program is an advanced mitigation perspective with the Department of Transportation. Each year, February 1st, the Department of Transportation gives DMS an advanced mitigation order that looks out 7 years in advance to, so DMS is constantly looking out for and trying to acquire credits in advance of transportation improvement projects, which has been a huge help to the program and honestly a huge help to DOT as well. You know, since this process began in 2003 with the Department of Transportation being a key customer, the Transportation Department has not missed any let dates since that time due to mitigation, which that's always been a huge thing with our transportation commissioners, and rightfully so.
Tim?
Yes, sir.
Isn't it by your old statute where your old DOT has to use DMS for it, where it's set up by statute where they are a mandatory customer of DMS?
Not by statute. We do have an MOA with DOT in order to ensure that any offsite mitigation does go to DMS. That is true, but it's not by statute.
Okay.
It's by a handshake agreement, more or less, is what a MOA tends to be in most cases. Other customers are private customers, small impactors and developers, very similar to the Kentucky program. So just to break down the different fund programs that DMS does have, like I say, our big one is the NCDOT program. The statewide program is the private permittee program, where a private permittee comes in the door, pays the fee, and it comes into this fund. North Carolina also has a riparian buffer and nutrient offset impact funds as well. And that is also set up. DOT can actually pay into these funds as well. In North Carolina, it's one thing that I've seen that in lieu fees have been looking into pretty hard, has tried to diversify into, other things. And one thing being this flood program, that natural infrastructure program that you see down here circled in red. So when DMS DEP was doing its dead level best to maintain a design bid build process, this O chart was about 60 people. And honestly, the program was about as inefficient as it could have been at that point in time. Our shift to performance-based contracting was allowed us to really get lean and mean and very efficient, down to 28 staff people. It's broken out generally between an admin procurement group, which if you think from the business side of things and in business terms, the operations project management is really your billable people, the people putting pounds on the ground, and your admin procurement is just what you would think it would be, is those folks that are supporting the project management folks, getting requests for proposals, getting any contracting processing done. This system has worked very well for us. It tends to be very efficient. We do have some in-house abilities, and I'll speak to that very soon, to do some of our own contracting processes that are overseen by the Department of Administration, our procurement agency in the state. And that's been very valuable in timing and getting contracts out the door and processed. And I know FILO is one thing that you guys have had to deal with, as far as having to deal with finance cabinet and not having some of those in-house services. And I say that's been a big help to North Carolina. And here's the slide I was referring to. So we do have some in-house RFP contract development services. All of that is reviewed by the NC State Procurement Agency, our Department of Administration, and DMS is allowed to execute contracts. So having that in-house has been very helpful for us. One thing that we talked about extensively when I was up in Kentucky with the FILO guys is site acquisition and some of the difficulties that you have in acquisition of property in Kentucky. We don't have a lot of mineral rights issues in North Carolina. There's some, but it's not a big a focus as it is in Kentucky. But we generally look at these property acquisitions as being easement acquisitions, and we rarely have fee simple acquisitions through our full delivery process. One thing that has been very beneficial to us, though, in that process is to have an easement template. What that does is provide a mitigation provider with a template it can share with a landowner, so that everybody knows up front exactly what they're signing on to as we go through the process. So having that template, the provider can take it to the landowner. They look at it. It makes it a whole lot more seamless when we go to closing. The provider will complete draft closing documents and send it over to our state property office. All acquisitions are done for the state of North Carolina in the processes that the state would normally go through, as far as the checks and balances, if you will, for accepting property interest into the state system. And once final approval is done by our state property office, the mitigation provider actually closes the acquisition with the landowner and transfers the easement interest would then actually transfer into the state at closing. Scott and Rob asked me to share a little bit about the payment structure for the North Carolina performance-based contract, full delivery contracts. And it's a little different than things that I think FILO has done in the past, in which we provide a task payment release of payment based on task delivery over time. And it's something that is a little bit different is we do an environmental screening regulatory site visit. This environmental screening is a NEPA process, categorical exclusion, that once that initial site visit is done, and that category exclusion is approved, then we make the 5% payment. And as you can see, you know, once you get up to the bulk of the payments are done by the time you get to as-built. One reason that we front load this, one is to make it a little bit more economical for the production of these sites and providing it to DMS. And two, we feel like that once the projects are built and we're monitoring this and we're working with the providers all through this process. So, you know, it's not like we give them a contract to go out and do something and we pay for it and then, you know, we're kind of shocked when the as-built happens. We're with them through this process. So we kind of know once the monitoring year one and the project's built, you know, what we're dealing with. We feel like once we get to that point, if there was some issues with contracting, the provider would back out, that we would be able to sustain, you know, the project and carry it out through monitoring and total credit release. So, you know, these task payments have worked very well for us. I will say one thing that is very critical to this process is that providers get paid for performance delivery. If they don't deliver on the task, they don't get paid. If we get to monitoring year two, say, and the provider, the project is losing credits, or, you know, there's an amount of credits that we know that the provider will not be able to produce and yield, we'll start adjusting payments then. And it may be that when we get to close out, the provider's writing us a check for what it did not produce that we may have overpaid on. So, you know, there's a lot of checks and balances here to make sure that the in lieu fee, that DMS is getting what it's paying for, and, you know, it's not kind of the wild west of contracting. One thing that as director of mitigation services that I saw several years ago in the whole in lieu fee world was that we weren't communicating together as much as we could, and we began in, you know, Rob's group and many other in lieu fee programs, about 50, I think, across the state, across the country, have been instrumental and involved in kind of communicating pretty hard in the last few years, trying to get, you know, younger programs connected with older programs to do some mentoring and that sort of thing. And I tell you, one of the biggest challenges I see that our in lieu fees face are these things. One is the timing. Project implementation, permitting, and credit development, you know, having to stay a watershed-centric project selection. You know, the federal mitigation rule requires in lieu fees to have a watershed-based procurement strategy and doing mitigation, putting projects on the ground. Staffing has always been a huge issue for in lieu fees. The state procurement process, I'll tell you, and I say it over and over again everywhere I get a chance to speak, you know, these state agency procurement agencies have no idea how to acquire ecosystem services that in lieu fees produce. Mitigation credits are something that they just cannot conceive, and it's difficult to get them to understand that when you work through these processes. And also the regulatory processes, honestly, are a big challenge. And I will challenge that in that regard, that credit procurement process and how credits are procured solves a lot of these problems. And you know, in my mind, and we have shown it with DMS, performance-based contracting has solved a lot of these issues that we faced as an ILF over time. I know I've talked a lot about these different topics and different procurement strategies. Just to give you a little bit more definition of what I mean by talking by these individual processes, procurement strategies. Design, bid, build is where an in lieu fee would identify the site, acquire the property, and contract for individual pieces. Contract for design, contract for construction, contract for monitoring, and these, in our experience, this has been the most risky procurement process that we had engaged in. Design, bid, build, we've always considered a kind of a full delivery light, where we had an interest in property, and for whatever reason, and we would basically contract out the delivery of credits on that piece of property, just like we would a full delivery. Full delivery performance-based contracting is that a request for proposal is put on the streets for the amount of mitigation that we need. Private mitigation providers would respond to that request for proposal. They would identify a piece of property. They would put an option on that piece of property to purchase so that we know that there was some lock-in, I guess you could say, for the land interest. And then respond with a technical proposal on how they intend to develop those credits on that property, and also a cost proposal. This performance-based contracting system has been, like I said, one that we continue to use and has been one of the most successful that we've done so far. Purchase of bank credits is just what it is. It's, it's kind of like going to Walmart and purchasing whatever you may purchase. You go to the bank entity and you just make a purchase of those credits. Because DMS adjusted its procurement strategy is the reason I believe that we've had a good success in North Carolina of delivering mitigation. We have, and the biggest part of that is that private sector driven credit delivery has, honestly, we would not have been able to deliver the amount of credits that we did over time without that. We've got a faster response to any credit needs. Our staff is a lot more efficient. We have cost certainty, which honestly, with many other procurement processes other than performance-based contracting and full delivery, is difficult at best. Our risk aversion has gotten a lot lower, and our regulatory processes are much smoother. Because we are running these full delivery contracts, they have timeline deliveries that are pretty succinct and pretty set. So, DMS and our regulatory folks know when those things are happening. And, we have certain trigger points that we go ahead and schedule in advance and are able to get our regulatory folks on the ground a lot faster and more smoother to make decisions. And what it's meant to North Carolina in general is that we do have a very strong mitigation market. We've got a huge backlog of our credit supply for our permanent impacts. And we also have a pretty good public-private mitigation partnership. Our mitigation providers have honestly helped the program out tremendously to grow and achieve where it's been so far. And we have market-driven credit fees. We know how much mitigation costs because we are focused on that credit delivery and not having to deal with the difficulties of land purchase and other things that we may have to deal with. So, Rob, that's it in a nutshell. I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Can you touch on, from the time you first started the program, from a timeline perspective, from when the program decided to issue an RFP to the point the RFP was awarded, when you started the program and when you left, because of the familiarity with your finance cabinet or your purchasing, how that's changed over the years and how that timeline has become expedited? Tim's mute.
There you go. All right.
Yeah.
So, early on, as you can imagine, our procurement agency was pretty particular about the process and watching it, from each individual part. As we went on and built a relationship with our procurement agency, we got a little bit more leash, if you will, to do more things within our division. About a year ago, we actually had delegated authority from our procurement agency to allow DMS to do its own procurement in-house. So now, all contracts, except for, any design bid build contracts, but all full delivery contracts and credit purchase actually go through DMS, are propagated by DMS. and our department is kind of our watchdog to make sure that nothing goes awry. But
I'm sorry, is that delegated authority specifically limited just to credits, or is it purchasing as a whole?
is limited to credits, which is generally full delivery and bank credit purchase.
But if you all wanted to buy vehicles, equipment, et cetera, that would go through that's not delegated. That would still have to go through the regular procurement process.
Correct. That's right. That's right.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any questions for Tim while his presentation is fresh in our mind?
Gary Moore here. I have a couple. So the calculation of credits, if a property is being explored, is that done in-house at DMS, or do you still work through an IRT or through the Corps?
Sure. Thanks, Gary. So the mitigation provider will provide DMS a proposal in the RFP process on how many credits they believe it will generate. We, together with the mitigation provider, will take that to the IRT, and the IRT will basically either bless or deny, some of that credit. And from that point on, we make a decision whether we want to go forward with the project or not. There has been times that the provider would anticipate, an amount of credit. The IRT would totally disagree. And, we would have to make a decision then whether it was economically viable to continue on the new credit strategy or not. But it's basically a mix of all those, but the provider makes the initial determination or initial proposal, let's say.
Thank you. Another question I have, it sounds like that DMS holds the easements and does the monitoring in-house. Is that accurate?
No, sir. So this is a full delivery of mitigation credits. The mitigation provider is being contracted to deliver all portions of the project, design, construction, monitoring. The DMS contract is a quasi service contract. So what we're paying for is credit delivery. Whatever it takes for that provider to deliver that credit to DMS is what we're being paid for. So DMS does not do the monitoring nor any other aspects. We do comment on the design, the mitigation plan, as-built, and the monitoring, and are kind of the conduit between the provider and the IRT. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Tim, this is Catherine. Thanks for such a super informative presentation. Your program's been so successful. Lots of good learnings to take from it. It sounds to me, please tell me if this is a fair characterization, that you have a toolkit, that inverted triangle that you showed, where kind of your most used quivers in the toolkit are buying released mitigation bank credits and doing full delivery. Like the program's evolved so that those are your two go-to methods. Can you talk a little bit about what are your sort of internal policies, written or unwritten, about when you buy mitigation bank credits versus when you would turn to the full delivery tool?
So that's a good question, Catherine. There are a lot of different aspects that may make that decision for us. One being, it may be an area that we need wetland credits primarily. There may be a bank that has mostly stream and not enough wetland. So we would go ahead and do a full delivery contract and forego purchasing those credits. It may be, honestly, that those credits are just too stinking expensive. And, that the bank doesn't want to back off its price, and, it's more economical for us to go that way. There are times too when the bank may have credits that are a certain type of credits that we could purchase. but it may be that if we purchase those credits, we would not have a viable full delivery contract. And because we are on the hook for, an amount of mitigation credits, say the bank had, say we needed 10,000 stream mitigation units. The bank had, 7 of those, but, and we may have needed some wetland. There may be, it may not give us an opportunity for a viable full delivery to get that extra 3,000. It may put us behind time. So it's honestly very much like, you guys or the private industry does, is it's a business decision based on when to pull that trigger or not. And, and honestly, sometimes the court just says no. Where there may be a weird service area with the bank, there may be some aspects to the permit that the Corps says no. The in lieu fee needs to issue the full delivery and not go the bank credit route. So there are many different trigger points that honestly, I hate to say use this word, but case by case is generally how it works out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. It sounds like it's kind of a combination of availability, credit type, price, and regulatory agency determination.
Correct. That's right.
Cool.
I had a question. Did you see any change when y'all went to the full delivery on the private sector, or have you got any feedback from them about, I guess, like the type of firms that were able to deliver on a full delivery? Did you see a reduction in, who you all worked with or any of that type of situation? And how's that feedback come from them since, y'all implemented this full delivery?
Obviously, there was some shift because we were doing design bid build. We worked with several firms that were just strictly design, did not have any interest in any construction aspects. Honestly, some companies didn't have the ability to bond and carry those bigger contracts over time. So there was some shift, a little bit, not a tremendous amount. Those pure design firms actually began working with some of the full delivery providers. So, they found a home, I guess, if you would, to work in. But, there's probably 8 to 10, 12, maybe full delivery providers in North Carolina that consistently are the ones that are contracted with. So there's not a huge pool, but it is a good competitive market in getting it for mitigation in North Carolina. So there was some shift, and I think providers have really liked the opportunity to have a payout over time, task payout in the full delivery process. When you compare to banks and you've got to build a bank and hope you sell those credits, this is a little bit different whether you kind of have a guaranteed customer over time. So I think our mitigation providers have been very, very pleased with the process.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
It's been great questions so far. I have one, if I'll go ahead and ask, and maybe some others will think of questions. Tim, I was wondering if you could clarify for us the easement holder in that, like when you all do a project, who your third party site protection instrument holder and enforcement is exactly.
Sure. So in the process I described with full delivery, the provider will actually use the template to make the easement acquisition. That template, actually, the template directs the mitigation or the easement interest to the state of North Carolina. So the state of North Carolina is the easement holder. Once we go through the process of building the site and go to closeout, we actually have a stewardship program in DEQ that will manage those sites. We pay an endowment to that stewardship program, and they will manage the easement compliance from then out. Luckily, North Carolina is one of the states, and I guess in Kentucky is the same way, is you don't get tied up into a lot of the invasive management over time, beaver management, and that sort of thing. Is basically easement compliance. So our endowments are pretty reasonable for that, so.
Yeah, we have a little bit of management that kind of never goes away. It depends on the site, like Beavers, for example. If it's a high use area with public involvement, then we might manage beavers a little bit if they become a problem, or invasive species from a vegetative standpoint. We really try to hit that hard early on and be done with it, but sometimes there's a lingering issue there as well.
Tim, is part of the component when it's owned by, or when it's turned over to the stewardship entity, is the land available or opened up to public access?
No, there's no public access at all to any of our DMS easements. In fact, it's strictly, I'll say strictly, it's the easement does not give any public access, and there's no inference of that in the easement. The easement actually references that. It's not to say that, I know you guys have a different perspective on that, and not to say that it couldn't be done that way. I think it would need to be, especially in a full delivery model, those things that are wanted and intended to have need to be mapped out, initially, so providers can have that initial conversation with those landowners, whether it's, total fee simple purchase or easement or whatever it is.
Yeah. You had mentioned earlier in regard to Catherine's question, which was good, talking about outlining, for lack of a better description, case by case analysis. What types of calculus is done when you start evaluating a site as to whether it would be more beneficial for a fee acquisition versus just an easement? And when it is acquired in fee, who in North Carolina takes over the fee ownership?
The fee ownership that we have dealt with in DMS has gone to the state of North Carolina as a donation of sorts. We've got a little different perspective in North Carolina. Honestly, if I never had to take another interest in land in North Carolina DMS, it'd be a happy day. But I know that Kentucky has a little more interest in the land aspect of these mitigation sites. So we have a little bit different perspective there. But generally, to answer your question, there's really not a trigger point. We made a decision that easements is, I guess, the least painful option for us because owning land in fee has a lot of aspects, as y'all well know, that an easement doesn't have. Having it in private ownership actually helps us a great deal rather than going to public ownership. So,
are there any tax incentives in North Carolina for state income tax where a property owner, obviously they can donate it and then it becomes a donation for tax purposes, but are there any favorable tax consequences or tax exemptions for income produced but through the sale of a property owner to a conservation easement?
There used to be a tax allowance, I guess you could say, that but the problem with that is there had to be a donation of easement. These easements that we're talking about now for DMS are paid for. Provider actually makes payment, as part of the total contract for the easement acquisition. So I don't know of any tax advantage for an easement that is actually purchased. No.
I was just curious because, obviously you mentioned site acquisition and, you can only, it takes two to dance and you need a willing property owner. And other than they're relying on their benevolence for doing something to memorialize in a conservation easement, I was just curious to see if there were any other incentives that North Carolina might have with action other than relying upon a landowner's goodwill. And then obviously they're getting paid too, but I just didn't know if there was any other incentives.
Well, full delivery providers sitting down with a private landowner, private to private, they get their incentives where they want to be sometimes, as far as making that purchase of land. In all honesty, I've seen easement payments that have gone out to landowners that they probably could have bought the land in fee for that amount of money, and the landowner still, holds the land. So those, as far as DMS is concerned, I'm interested in the credit purchase and the total credit amount that I'm getting and what I'm paying for that credit. What they pay for the land, I could care less, honestly.
Right. Tom Fitzgerald, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a couple if I could. First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to present to us. I had a couple of questions regarding the easements that you acquire. Well, first of all, I guess, how much riparian area next to the water body, whether it be a wetland or a flowing stream, do you acquire as part of the easement in order to protect the quality of the water body?
We have a requirement from the Corps to do at least 50 feet from edge of stream.
Okay.
I did find out it was very different situation in Kentucky versus North Carolina. Is corridor easements are not as accepted, I guess, in Kentucky they are in North Carolina. But we have a lot of corridor easements in North Carolina. Our RRT has given incentives for wider buffers that. Sometimes the economics works out, sometimes it doesn't. But the minimum requirement is 50 feet from edge of stream.
Okay, because it would seem to me that, in terms of a landowner who was willing to grant a conservation easement, that they could actually potentially get some conservation reserve monies from the federal government to widen that buffer in order to create a riparian corridor that would filter out any sort of sediment or any other problems. I guess the other question was, who enforces the terms of the easement? Because I think the idea of acquiring less than a fee interest is one that I find intriguing, because it would in many cases allow you to stretch your money further. And it is a whole lot easier to acquire an easement than it is to go through a fee purchase. And to the extent that private parties are engaging in that and putting their capital at risk, it certainly would potentially create a project, if your preservation or even some restoration, the project could go a whole lot faster. But I'm wondering who enforces the terms of the easement so that you don't have a situation where somebody either knowingly or in many cases unknowingly would come in, purchase the property, and violate the terms of the easement.
So during the time frame of the contract for full delivery, and while the project is open, DMS and provider enforce the terms of the easement. Honestly, the provider has the relationship with the landowner more than DMS does in most cases. Right. So they're making that enforcement for us on our behalf for the most part.
Okay, so they would.
You always, sometimes you have that bad actor that will step in and use our attorney general's office or our counsel to start pushing back on that landowner. But in general, most everybody's pretty good to deal with. But,
okay, great.
But once the project is closed out, then the state stewardship program, the NRDEQ, actually does the enforcement beyond there. So basically, in general, it's Department of Environmental Quality throughout. It's either within DMS or otherwise. And I would say on your first question, talking about the conservation reserve money on the outside, and one thing a landowner can do is negotiate that up front with the provider to do those wider buffers and get paid, whatever land price for those. That would probably be more than the conservation reserve price would be, I would imagine.
Oh, that's a good point. Plus, you'd have
to keep those very separate. You couldn't let those merge, those federal monies merge into mitigation money. So.
Yeah, they couldn't overlap. No, I absolutely understand. Thank you very much. I appreciate your presentation.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I think I'll probably add a little bit to that for Tom Fitzgerald's question, and from our perspective, just so everybody understands what we do with that, because that wasn't something I was already going to speak to, but we have the minimum of 50 as well, from a technical buffer distance standpoint. We also have a wider point at 100 that is a little bit more credit. And they're recently looking at sort of watershed scale credit protection. But to what Tim said with regard to a lot of mitigation in Kentucky, if the agencies are comparing one site versus another, for example, not that that often happens, but they look very hard at that adjacent land use. If you're talking about corridors as to whether or not that's an acceptable mitigation site. So they wouldn't be all right with a corridor, for example, next to a ATV park, that you may have a bad sedimentation situation there. So that can affect your site selection. It goes into that to some degree. And to speak to the long-term stewardship on our end, you know, like you kind of mentioned, the fee simple part in certain situations where we have a public access component is probably optimal for us. But it also lets us be the enforcement, the long-term enforcement, which, you know, the department is very good at with regard to our properties. So there's a lot of similarities, but some very important nuances, at least with the in lieu fee sites. But I also know that we've been approached, the agency has been approached, not necessarily the in lieu fee program, with regard to absorbing older mitigation sites where, you know, the original provider as a bank, not as an in lieu fee project, are no longer able to or interested in maintaining that long-term site protection, and they look to the department as a possible endpoint for those sites. And, you know, that may be something that's desirable, and I think has been done in the past on a few occasions, but there's a lot that goes into that, obviously, whether it's a desirable piece of property for the department in general, but something to think about as we delve into this evolution of our program.
So Mike, just to clarify, so because something that Tim said triggered a question I had that I think you just answered, but Tim described, you know, in North Carolina, their objective is to get the credits, but not necessarily to have anything to do with the fee simple. Is, just so I understand completely, is what you're describing is a little bit different, where FILO does have an interest in owning fee simple in certain places, or?
I would say we certainly do, but that's definitely case by case.
Okay.
You know, FILO is a component of the Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, whose primary mission is hunting and fishing for the citizens of Kentucky, and that you know, the access component, that's, you know, obviously a part of that. So that's something that we consider. But even with our easements, which do not grant public access, we are the long-term site protection enforcement.
And that's always been a historical component of the project, is the ability for the Resource Conservation Agency with the public access mission to acquire, to be able to utilize these funds to acquire public property and to enhance existing wildlife management areas. And that's been that goes back to the historical inception of the program.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. No,
Yeah, I'm sorry, just to follow up on this, I had two questions. One was back to North Carolina for a second. Does the Corps discount the credits that are created if you have an easement as opposed to fee ownership?
No, I don't know what it is for North Carolina. For Kentucky, they don't discount them necessarily, but you may get a different credit rate or ratio in your calculation depending on how you're doing that. Like, for example, if we do 100-foot buffer versus 50, that gets a different ratio.
Okay, and let me pose this question to Kentucky, and this is hopefully not an unfair question. I am second to none in my appreciation for the mission of the Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. I was remembering back the other day my efforts to keep horses off of one of the fish and wildlife properties in eastern Kentucky, and and my memory of the advocate for getting the horses on the property just said at one point that Fish and Wildlife just doesn't like horses. And I said, well, actually, I don't think they like you. I think they like horses just fine. But let's just say it was a somewhat fraught conversation. But I guess I have a concern. Does the historical interest of Fish and Wildlife in providing access to fishing lands, to hunting opportunities, does it in any way limit the choice of projects that you all are looking at? Because, for example, if it were Division of Water, right, that was interesting. You know, their mission is in one respect a more narrow mission, as is, for that matter, the Corps' mission, which is important but narrow because they're concerned about offsetting the loss of waters of the United States to different projects. And I just wanted to make sure that the overlay of wanting to provide access didn't slow the process or didn't complicate the identification of potential projects. I mean, where you can get both, I think that's wonderful. You know, people tend to love and value and protect what they know and what they experience. But I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't complicating the expenditure of these in lieu monies, because unlike the monies that come from stamps and licenses, these are paid in for a very specific purpose.
Absolutely. I can say definitively that the desire to have a WMA doesn't really come into play with site selection at all for us, really. And I think we could probably look back and send out some numbers if people are interested, but we probably still have more projects in easement than we do fee simple acquisition. And, you know, in some cases, those fee simple acquisitions are too small to be a WMA, or not really appropriately positioned to be a good WMA. So it's an ancillary benefit, but it does tie very well with the regulatory agencies, at least as they've informed us, notion, and it works back really well with what Tim mentioned as part of the rule, the watershed outlook, where we can, in some cases, you know, they, albeit small-ish, but maybe acquire an entire watershed, and then you've kind of got a protected resource in and of itself right there on a piece of property. So the WMA aspect is certainly helpful, but it isn't a driver.
Not
Okay, thank you.
And it's not a limiting factor. If we have two competing projects and the conservation easement is more valuable and more unique from an ecological standpoint than a small fee purchase, 10 out of 10 times we'll take the conservation easement.
Yep.
I had a quick question for Tim. And Tim, great job on your presentation. Was just wondering, what is the dollar volume size of your program? And I know that varies from year to year, but you know, maybe within the last 3 years, just from a dollar perspective.
Hey, George. We generally run about a $35 to $45 million budget per year. Maybe on the low side, 25 million, but that's generally the size of the program yearly.
Great. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
These are all great questions, everybody. I really appreciate everybody chiming in. We're about halfway through now the time we had allotted, and I'm ready to move on with, you know, kind of our sort of next step here in the presentation, unless there are more questions for Tim while it's still fresh in our minds. I'm happy to field those and get Tim's help. So if anybody has any, throw your hand up, unmute, start yelling, whatever you like. If not, we can move on. If you think of some, we'll have time here at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'll come back and share my screen here.
Hey, Rob, this is Commissioner Storm.
Yes, sir.
Just wanted to chime in with this group and let the folks know that the economic impact annually is about $182 per acre for public land usage. So we do have a considerable economic impact plus the tourism side of things, people traveling to the state of Kentucky. So I think it's important to point that out because oftentimes people mention that, you know, these properties are off tax base and little to virtually no economic return for the Commonwealth. But that's something I'm interested in. But $182 per acre per year, and equally or regionally distributed across the state. So just want to share that.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a great point. Is you know, we all benefit when we can get things right, and the public can join in these projects and be a part of it. I think that helps with the stewardship as well. So we're going to go on from here, but what we're going to do next is kind of walk you guys through some aspects of what we just heard from Tim in North Carolina. And some of this is going to be not to rehash, but to maybe point out some very important similarities and also some very, very critical differences that we have in a little bit of detail, and feel free to ask questions and we can flesh it out as we do that. But I'm gonna sort of shamelessly sort of steal from Tim's presentation just to help us keep them aligned in our minds as we go through this. So so moving on from there, and Scott, you interject as you need to. So here we're going to translate the North Carolina DMS inland fee program structure to our Kentucky situation. How are they similar? How are they different? And maybe equally importantly, what can we do now in Kentucky to make a similar evolution that North Carolina did, as Tim mentioned, in 2015, but not sacrifice the benefits and high functioning aspects of the existing program? And that's things like we were just discussing, where we can have these very, very good, you know, full watershed protection style projects whenever possible, and the benefit to the citizens of Kentucky with public access and enjoyment and recreation of these important parts of our ecosystem and our environment. So that's important to us. So starting out, just like I said, I'm going to walk through Tim's. Let me get a pointer here for you guys. So is my mouse visible to you all at this point? Okay, so that's going to help us point things out. So big red circle here, so this one's easy. But there's a difference in basis, where North Carolina has a very consistent, very high volume mitigation market in a lot of their service areas. The state of North Carolina is a little bit larger, but they have a lot more going on, and we'll kind of paint that picture as we go through. But except for a couple of service areas, and just to remind you all, we have 11 service areas throughout the state that cover, you know, Paducah to Paint and Pikeville. Except for a couple of those areas, we really have never experienced a consistent nor a high volume in most of the state. And like I think we mentioned in the previous work group meeting, that it's to the extent that maybe it's not really viable for a bank or at least profitable or a good economic decision for a bank in all service areas at all times. So that's something that we just have as a nature of the beast here in Kentucky that we need to figure out. And to show you guys, here's an example in our lower Kentucky River service area, the annual history of stream credits sold. You can see the volatility of this data. And in some cases with wetlands, the just non-existence of a lot of data. Like, you know, so you can imagine what it would take to do just these small projects all along the way. So this is very typical of what we're dealing with. And just to clarify, you see the years in here a couple of times. The spreadsheet I pulled these from delineates by the rate. So we had a rate change in 2017. So you see that a little differently. But anyway, the point is, you know, down to 1,000 in a year, 15,000 in another year, and really no predictability. Another aspect of that is a lot of times when we do have a big year, that's a result of one very large credit sale, and oftentimes with no notice, or very short-term notice. So just to kind of let you know, there's a very distinct difference in our basis there. But that's not to say that what we're learning from North Carolina won't be beneficial. It very much will be, as I think you'll see. Here we go. So we have 3 major procurement categories, and among those, a lot of methodology there. The design build and design bid build, like Tim spoke to, in this state, this requires a property acquisition by us.
Either in fee or easement.
Right. And, you know, contrastingly, we can do a full delivery project, but that prohibits property acquisition.
And that's when you think of the current RFP that's out for the Upper Cumberland, that is a full delivery solicitation. The property is not going to be owned and cannot be owned under our current statutes by the state. That has to be done. The property owner is the vendor or the third party who ultimately is going to acquire it. But we cannot, under current procurement law, we cannot have a full delivery cannot be utilized to deliver a conservation easement that is going to be possessed by the state.
So, and then lastly, we have, or the third, I should say lastly, purchase release credits from a mitigation bank. Now, in order to do this, a bank must already exist and have adequate volume in the service area of need, but also it requires the direction of the Corps of Engineers and their approval. So kind of like Tim said, that when they are making their business decision about whether or not to buy credits from a bank, it's not quite that simple for us, but the Corps does, you know, go through sort of a similar thought process. In addition to these 3 buckets, there's no mixing or mingling of the methods. So just kind of paint that. I mean, that's a very, very distinct difference that's going to drive a lot of what we're going to cover. So if anybody has any questions about any of that, please don't hesitate. Speak up, and we can always back up and flesh it out.
Hey, Rob, this is Catherine. Can you clarify what you mean by no mixing or mingling? Does that mean like within a given service area, if you put out an RFP for X, you can't do a combination of credits and full delivery? Or what do you mean by no mixing or mingling?
Well, it depends is really the answer. Like we couldn't do a combination of these on a single site with a single procurement is really the basis of what I was saying. But
okay,
we would have to, you know, kind of clearly lay that out, you know, whatever it was going to be. But
right, and like for example, in the Upper Cumberland, I mean, we've got hypothetically, if the RFP only produces 15 to 20 wetlands, we could do a design bid build if we found a site and to do the other 5 if we can. But they can't be on the same site and they can't be in the same procurement methodology.
got it. Okay, thank you.
good question. Thank you. So moving on, another grab from Tim, and I think some of us realized this as we were and maybe there were some questions about it, but you know, you notice here that 650 projects with 200 active at any given time. This is at least double, if not 5 to 10 times our states are in any one service area, and even the program as a whole statewide. Another important thing to point out that I think is part of a big factor in decision making and procurement is North Carolina has many types of credits. Kentucky just has stream and wetland, and that's really it. We don't have the nutrient credits, we don't have the buffer credits, and at this time, or really for any of those, I think North Carolina is developing some floodplain mitigation crediting, maybe in the future, but we don't have that either. So it's really just streams and wetlands for Kentucky. And additionally, North Carolina has its own NEPA process. And that's another big factor in a lot of the decision-making and the planning of their projects and their program. And lastly, you know, kind of to round out in response to this is, you know, the performance-based procurement will definitely address these factors as Tim mentioned, but just so everybody understands is that the program we have now does address these factors, and we do get a lot of what's going on here with their performance-based procurement with what we are doing now. Certainly we could improve that, but it's not that it's without consideration. So comparing us to their organizational size, they had 28 staff and a supporter. We have 10 full-time staff, 3 part-time staff. That includes our administrative and interagency liaisons. For example, Scott Porter is our primary liaison with the tourism cabinet as a whole and with the finance cabinet on the legal side. And Tony Wheatley is our property specialist, that he's our liaison with finance cabinet with regard to that acquisition. So, you know, they work in conjunction to kind of de facto, you know, fit in this admin procurement area. But we don't unilaterally go and do these things ourselves. These are, you know, very strictly under the guidance of the finance cabinet. And none of the actual project procurement happens in-house. It's all a finance cabinet situation. So as you can see, I mean, there's a lot of environmental scientists. We have pretty much the same types of people, but certainly not as large as this. And I think with what we've done, we're fairly skeletal and would like to fill our vacancies and maybe expand a little bit, regardless of, not largely, but add a few staff to help better respond, regardless of how we proceed with procurement methodology.
Hey, Rob, if I could,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tim.
if I could throw in on that, you know, you mentioned the volume that we have in North Carolina. You know, I think your structure is probably good for the volume that you have. You know, one thing that would be very beneficial to y'all, and we talked about before, is being able to do some of that baseline work for your procurement agency in-house, even though if it had to be sent over and approved, kind of greasing those skids with, you know, in-house through your budget specialists or other people to be able to cobble those packages together. So when it goes to finance cabinet, it you know, it's a checkbox and move on. That would be a big added benefit, I think.
And that's a very good point and a good description of how it works right now. It's cobbled together. We do draft a lot of what we have, but we're finding more and more that in order to do the things kind of the right way and get the right kind of acknowledgments and insurances in the process to achieve all of the results, we're still squeezing square pegs into round holes. So, and that's something we're going to dive into a little bit more as we proceed. Just to speak to that, what is a mitigation credit? Is it a service? Is it a good? Is it a commodity? You know, maybe it's none of these. And like you said, performance-based quasi-service. That's something that, you know, we think we need. Something that can be bid competitively with performance-based payouts and allows for that commodity style pricing. But we also want the capital project style budget ability, accounting ability, and an opportunity for public property acquisition, because that's very important for us in Kentucky, and we believe that helps manage risk as well. So you might remember this slide from the last time, and this is really just a reminder to kind of show you all that, you know, we operate on this blue line. as far as how we distribute the funds and the timing of how we try to get those funds out. And right now, our full delivery procurement, because it is strictly a commodity and we can't pay in advance of release, is pretty well stuck on the lower orange line. This is a fair, you might be able to reduce this initial 3-year time by as much as a year, but I think that would be maybe the most possible. But it still, that just would scoot the whole line back. It wouldn't necessarily advance any of the quantities in a given year. So we're held to our credit release schedule for that. And at this point in time, we have no alternative to that. We are, working with the Corps and regulatory agencies to explore if we can, kind of modify our credit release schedule. I think that will come at a cost of probably, maybe more work up front, which is, kind of expensive and will be just a bigger burden on that full delivery vendor. So we're trying to carefully tread through that.
And that gets back to the genesis of exactly what is a widget. I mean, when we are doing a design bid build project, that is a construction project. We are paying to have property improved, repaired, restored, enhanced. That's a construction project, but we own that property or we have an interest in that property. If we are doing a full delivery, the property has to be owned by a third party. It is not, there's no state ownership, and we are acquiring a credit. The credit is the end product that is being produced. Hence, we can't pay as we go along as you would for a normal construction project. You are paying when the credits, for lack of the actual property that you're acquiring, or the property, not property, but we are acquiring the tangential commodity, which is the credit. And we can't pay under the current procurement until that is actually produced and released.
Right. Catherine, you got a question?
Yeah, thanks. Makes total sense, everything you guys are describing. I have a question about this graph. So this graph shows essentially time versus when the funds are spent. If we were to do a graph that showed when funds are spent versus when obligations are fulfilled, right? I think the relationship between the two lines would be reversed, because what you just described is that the moment you pay for a credit under full delivery, right, you meet an obligation or you offset a liability taken on. So I think it would be helpful to juxtapose alongside this graph one that shows when funds are spent versus when FILO meets mitigation obligations, if that makes sense. Because in that case, the full delivery is actually more efficient, I think, because you're expending funds, as you described, only when you know you've got a credit in hand. So anyways, just a comment about that graph I wanted to point out.
Right, and I'll explain this a little better so you can see. The event points for both of these are the same. So the credit release for, say, for example, a mitigation plan approval and a site protection instrument would happen in this area. We will have already paid out for that site protection, obviously, and work for a mitigation plan. So sometime in here is going to be our first credit release. This will be the timing for our first credit release on a full delivery. So the credit release, the delivery of those credits is the same amount at the same time. This is just a graph of how the dollars move with them aligned by credit release.
Okay, thanks.
Tim, you got a question?
Yeah, just to kind of feed off of what y'all are saying, we have seen that when the private industry has been able to engage in the full delivery process, these timelines of getting to that first credit release, we generally have projects built and are being built in at least by year 2, sometimes depending on the size of the project, within that year 1 time frame. But it expedites that process tremendously to much faster than we've been able to do design bid build. Let's put it that way. I think if we talked about legislative fixes or whatever, to get to that point where you could encompass that land aspect and be able to pay on a task basis, I think you'll see a ramp up pretty hard of those timelines for full delivery, and as faster, not a lot faster than design bid build.
Right, and I agree with you completely, and I think that's where we're trying to head with this. And I'm hoping to use this as motivation for people to understand and make those very changes, because like you said, I mean, year 1 to 2 for us represents the property acquisition. It takes us about a year, sometimes maybe as little as 6 months, but sometimes, quite a bit longer to get that property acquired. That's our first payout. That's utilizing the funds. It takes another year or so to get through the permit process, because we can't start that without the ability to have the property. So you got kind of a dead period here where, we're working through the permitting process. And, I've expanded this a little bit, or, kind of rough estimates, but essentially, this point right here is as built for both of these processes. So you would have had your site protection instrument and your mitigation plan approval released at this time. This is your construction as built. And so the sum of our credit release for as built and site protection instrument and mitigation approval is 20%. So that's how many of the funds will have gone out at the as built in the full delivery version as it is today. In the design bid build version, 80 to 90% of those funds are going to be spent and put back into the economy, because we will have paid for design, we will have paid for engineering, we will have paid for the property, we will have paid for the construction. So that's what I'm saying. This chart is just a picture of today aligned by, these 2 different procurement methodologies aligned by credit release.
Yeah, and it's obviously there's a huge benefit to getting the 90% of the dollars out into the economy for sure. But I guess the flip side of that is, from a risk perspective, FILO's paid 90%, but only gotten 20% of the credits.
That's right.
Yeah.
But, and that's why we have things like financial assurances and bonds. And, there's some nuances there that sort of account for those differences.
Yep.
But we would also expect or hope that in an improved full delivery process, it would also include, it wouldn't just be scooting this line over. It would also include the ability to pay for some of those upfront tasks as they occur. So, I think, and I guess it's a great segue to this, where that year 5 on the chart here, this year 5 bar, vertical red dash, and this is from Tim's presentation about their payout schedule, is right here, task 6, baseline monitoring report, including as-built drawings. That's as-built right there. For us, that's 20% payout. For North Carolina, that's the sum of these percentages paid out. I'm sorry, that's 20% of credit, and that's 90%, 80 to 90% of payout. Sorry, I misspoke. So yes, there's a disparity between our payout and our credit release.
75.
But they're also at 75 with their full delivery, the same span of time.
Yeah, and we get a 30% release at as-built too, if I remember correctly, so.
Yeah. So a little bit, they have a little bit less disparity between the release and the payout. But certainly, you know, they're in theory out over their skis a little bit too, but they have a procurement mechanism that protects them, you know, should there not, you know, something, you know, horribly go wrong, whereas ours may not. So that's the kind of thing that, you know, we have to be cognizant of if we make changes.
Hey, Rob, this is George. Just to clarify, the way you describe that, just want to make sure everybody understands that when you get to the as-built with the full delivery system that Kentucky has in place right now, the payout is roughly only about 20%. That's
Yeah.
correct. Okay.
Right.
And that graph shows it. It just, with some of the comments you made, that I just wasn't 100% sure that was clear, because you also tied that to credit release.
Right. And that's the thing, like the full delivery basically represents both payout and credit release simultaneously to the same extent, the way it is now. But what, you know, that's what I'm saying is North Carolina's full delivery version of payout and their credit release is a little bit different, but you know, it's kind of like this difference, but a little bit tighter. But anyway, the point of it all is the objective is to get the full delivery procurement mechanism more similar to the traditional contracting mechanism, so that your payouts can be based on tasks, not just credit release. So just an important kind of distinction that there's a lot of weeds there to kind of wade through, but I'm happy to you know, delve back through that, just to make sure everybody's got a pretty good grip on it, because that's a very important distinction in those processes. And I think, you know, it's one reason why, you know, is even though we have this full delivery out there and it's a better iteration than the one we did years ago, it's still not what, you know, you hear people talking about when they're saying, you know, North Carolina does full delivery, you also be doing full delivery. You know, we can't do what that is, not today. So, gosh, this thing's always in my way. So just a little bit about, moving on, a little bit about mitigation project right away, property acquisition. They use a land steward entity, which I think, you know, we fleshed it out a little bit with Tim before, and I just want to reiterate it here for the presentation, especially in case you guys take this on after this and share it or anything like that. But it's a mission of KDFWR, the Fish and Wildlife Department, to have this public access component, and we believe that's a good part of conservation at large. We're experts at conservation and we're experts at land management. So that really makes this agency ideal to be that third party, long-term, you know, stewardship and enforcement of mitigation projects. And I think we want to be that, at least to some degree, or when it can be mutually beneficial. So we'd like to retain that as we work our way through. One little aspect, a nugget, and this has been mentioned before, but when we do this and utilize the state funds in this manner, not so much with the full delivery as it is today, these can be used to match federal dollars for other purposes. In a lot of cases, not in all cases. For example, you can't match a 319 grant to mitigation dollars, not in Kentucky at least. But there are many other, you know, federal match dollar opportunities that we may lose if we can't evolve our procurement methodology.
Can we anticipate this really coming into play if RAWA passes federally?
Yeah. So, gosh, dang. All right, so back to the comparisons, just to give everybody, paint a better picture for everybody. You can see DMS's fund programs. They have the other credit types. They distinguish their DOT portion from the general available ILF, and they have customers in the manner expressed kind of in the upper left-hand corner. FILO is quite a bit more linear. The program exists and all customers are equal from a standpoint of being a customer. That includes KYTC for roads, transportation for air and rails done a little bit differently, but still that's, still just differently from roads, I should say. For us, they're still just a customer. Utilities, development, mining kind of round out the big components of, what makes up the FILO program funds. The bulk of our funds is KYTC roads. Lifespan, I think it's lower now than it used to be, down to about 50 to 55% of total funds. But that's not including the air and rail. And the reason why is because a lot of times those like airport permits for airport expansion or rail expansion often happen through a private entity, not straight from an interagency sort of departmental transfer. So I don't see that as a KYTC payment per se. It may look like a payment from the Boone County Airport Board or some, not that that's a real entity. I'm just saying it's not KYTC. So just kind of paint that picture of who our customers are, and we don't have a shortcut per se with KYTC the way DMS would have with their DOT. So back to those challenges that the military programs face that Tim mentioned, and these are all very important challenges. I think all mitigation providers experience some of these, at least to some extent, especially the regulatory processes. But rather than harp on those, we have an objective of timing, certainly, but in and of itself, I don't think these timing for the Kentucky and Luffy program, I don't think these are the problems. I think our bigger issues are in the procurement, the budgeting that we do or have to do, a little bit to some degree staffing, and that kind of plays back to, if we're going to make some major changes as far as how the program is going to proceed, then we have some very different staffing decisions to make, basically, in as short a time span as possible. But also service areas for us. And this, I'm tying this to what Tim mentioned is watershed-centric project selection. That's equate those two, I guess, for the sake of discussion, and especially with respect to that property protection requirement and limitations with regard to things like title severances. I think, the private sector is going to have those problems as well. And we'll speak to that a little bit more later also, but just to tie that back to what Tim, we learned from Tim in Kentucky, the biggest one of these by far that we see solutions to in the short term is procurement and budgeting.
Yeah, and just to emphasize budgeting, one of the things that we have to deal with is, as a state agency, we are subject to the budget passed by the General Assembly. And in the last budgeting session, the General Assembly stopped the Office of State Budgets Director's ability to grant an appropriation increase during the fiscal year. It used to be if you had if we found a project, in other words, Catherine, you'll appreciate this, is if we found a project tomorrow that was not budgeted in this year, we could not touch it until the next budgeting cycle, because the General Assembly shut down the state budget director's ability to do that. So that's one of the things, because FILO is a trust and agency fund that is comprised of money paid by a third party. It is not state dollars. As we explore processes going forward in order to give us more flexibility to operate either design bid build or a full delivery methodology, when the need arises, we're going to have to look at budget language or something in our procurement to be able to allow that flexibility, because again, as a state agency, we're subjected to the budget restrictions. And, you know, heaven forbid, we did find the ideal unicorn project that would be unique. Well, we can't get we can't get an appropriation now to go forward with it.
Yeah, I think we talked about that at the first work group meeting. You described that issue, and I think if I'm remembering right, you also described that that was a limitation on your ability not only to do full delivery in the way you just described, but also to buy mitigation bank credits off the shelf.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we
Okay.
have the forecast. I mean, you know, Tim talked about it. I think he said, Tim, I could be wrong, but I thought you said North Carolina DOT operates on a 7-year plan. Well, we have the 6-year road plan, but the reality of it is, you know, we're getting ready to go into 2022 under this current language. We'd be basically throwing a dartboard on what our mitigation needs going to be in 2024.
Yeah, that seems really challenging, and like it would be a really good thing to fix.
Right. And I think to kind of to flesh that example out a little more, or that another example really, full delivery projects right now, they're ongoing. They'll pay it, you know, these projects are 7, 8, 10 years long. And each payment in and of itself is several $100,000, maybe even in excess of millions of dollars, $1 million. If we got off schedule because of a permitting delay or some aspect of the process for whatever reason, then that would put our operating budget for that fiscal year. If we missed a payment within a quarter, you know, and it got shifted to the next fiscal year, then you've all of a sudden upended our operating budget by $1 million, you know, and then that next one would have to absorb that. So that's something that, you know, we definitely need some flexibility with that regard that right now today just isn't there. We've planned for the stuff that we've got in the hopper right now, but our ability to add to that or adjust what we have is very, very, very limited. So that's a big concern for us. And to note, to kind of put the really highlight on that doesn't affect the capital project at all. Like, capital projects aren't bound by the fiscal biennium operating budget in the way that your operating budget is bound. The capital projects are set aside with funding at the beginning. You know, there's much more flexible with how you can add and when you can add funds to those projects. And once they're there, you can spend them whenever you need to going forward. So there's another reason why we need the full delivery project to operate, if not like as a capital project, something much more like it. So sorry, Scott had an important call. He had to step out, but I'm going to rock on, and hopefully I won't skip anything he was wanting to say. So anyway, just to reiterate, you know, a lot of people, I don't think anybody here does, but like I said before, some of the stuff here is just to point out in case this presentation gets shared. Of course, we're going to post it later. ILFs are not mitigation banks. And they're, you know, the rule defines them differently with different, you know, they're unique and operate under, you know, different procedures. But we do have the same end goal of providing mitigation. But pretty much, you know, a lot of the terminology is the same, but the procedure and working through how we work through projects and programs is quite a bit different. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to work with mitigation banks. We certainly want any mitigation credit vendor to be available to the program to work with, you know, in any way that benefits the Commonwealth. So that's really our goal. But that's an important distinction to make, because I think it gets people, we tend in the industry to get a little bit sloppy when we say bank or mitigation provider and inland fee and what that really means. So it's something I just like to make sure that, you know, anybody else who's going to look at this again, I know we all know that, but and so you can freely share this and make sure that that's a point well made. Not to mention, and to kind of spread that a little thinner, we also want vendors to not necessarily need to be big, huge companies or nationwide mitigation bankers. If there's an operator in Kentucky, small business owner that wants to do a little bank and can meet our needs, then we want them to be able to do that. So that's kind of, why that the distinction of vendor is something we like to make clear.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back, also circling back to, a design bid build. It may be or whoever's building and doing the construction and restoration may actually also have a bank, but we're actually contracting for the construction service. Likewise, with the full delivery that's out there, there may be under the general umbrella, there may be a bank, it may be a bank of that corporate structure, but what we are contracting for is the construction and development and production of credits. So, it's the classic third grade Venn diagram where the overlapping circles.
Yeah. And so that brings us to kind of the really the important part of this, the kicking off of from now on. What can the work group do, and what can we do, and where do we go from here? I think we know a lot of people are interested, and there's a lot of potential users of mitigation banks and in lieu fee program, and people out there doing permittee responsible mitigation. So we think with right now with what we've learned, not just from North Carolina, but from our regulatory agencies and from the work group thus far, and really just experience in general, we think we've got some ideas here that we're going to walk through that will improve mitigation, not just for the in lieu fee program, but really for everybody, because I think it'll open up, kind of create a playing field where more people can play in a lot easier manner.
Yeah, and Catherine, that's when we do have our next meeting, and Fitz as well, one of the things we'd also like to hear the work group to consider is from a mitigation provider's perspective, or somebody that or we may even reach out to the Home Builders Association who needs mitigation, not outside of the in lieu fee program. What can be done to incentivize mitigation development in Kentucky? Can it be sweetening tax incentives to make somebody a more willing seller? Can there be something done to the conservation easement statute to address minerals, like the language that's already been circulated or that you all, I think, are reviewing? Or can look at, what can be done in that regard? Just in general, what can be done to incentivize mitigation across Kentucky, and not just having banks and having the bank ILF relationship. What can we do to incentivize stream restoration as a whole? And we'd be interested in seeing that kind of presentation at the next group.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. That's a great idea, because as you say, that the holistic issue here is how can we most efficiently help permittees meet their mitigation needs, whether they're buying in lieu fee credits or some other mechanism. So yeah, we'd be happy to.
Yeah, exactly. And like you mentioned in the last work group meeting, when we talked about specific service areas and why banks have not been able to get established in a specific service area, and you said at this time it's not an economically viable option in an area like Eastern Kentucky where we have mineral issues or whatever, or there's very little development and there's the need. However, when looking at like North Carolina, what they're doing with potentially flood credits, and as we've seen the last year or 2 years, Kentucky's been ravaged by floods. What can be done to incentivize and make it outside of an in lieu fee program? What can be done statewide that makes it decent or makes it a viable opportunity for a mitigation bank or a mitigation vendor to go in and do work in those areas. And then if you have to hold the property for 3, 4, 5 years until those credits are needed to be produced, what can be done to help to help minimize your all's risk in that regard? And then everybody benefits as a whole. And I'm really in particular would like to see what your all's thoughts are on the conservation easement mineral language.
Yeah, I was just reading that yesterday, and we'd love to provide comments and thoughts. These are all really good constructive ideas of how we can solve some challenges here. So
Well,
yeah.
and I'd like, while the iron is hot, we know with the benefit of what we've seen with Ford coming into Kentucky, but we also, federally, we do have the infrastructure bill. So what can be done now while the iron is hot to look across statewide?
So we've got the next couple of slides here, kind of an outline of just what we've been talking about. Kind of the impetus of all these, notions of procurement or policy changes, whatever that we've come up through, what we learned from North Carolina, what we think, would be beneficial here and retain the value of mitigation for Kentucky in a specific way. This is our outline. This isn't a draft of statutory changes per se. It's just an outline of the idea at this point, and something that I would hope that you guys can kind of sink your teeth into a little bit after the meeting. Now, if we got for everything we got time for, but certainly after the meeting, and send us your ideas as well. In response to this, but I'll kind of just walk us through it. So first of all, we think we would need statutory changes, something that mirrors the uniqueness of what the North Carolina mitigation program did, especially with the procurement methodologies, the way in which we're able to utilize our budget, and hopefully also property acquisition. Frankly, I think we've kind of licked property acquisition to the extent that we can, in large part due to Scott's presence here in the program, and Tony Wheatley, as you saw on the slide before, just having those dedicated personnel with FILO is 100% of their priority. And that's really all it took to start turning those wheels again that got kind of rusty for a while. And we've, so to the extent that we're able to within the current procurement allowances, that's moving. So that's a great thing, but I think there's improvements that we can make still. It's just those will be on a little bit higher level than we have right here today. And then also, like Scott has mentioned, maybe there's some incentivization measures for property transfers, either for conservation, whether that's to a private vendor or an in-lieu fee program, be it with the state or whatever that is. And one of those that he had mentioned yet was appraisal methodology, where we've seen this in another instance or two, maybe out of state, where mitigation as a highest and best use as an appraisal of a piece of property may generate a better value for that property, so that the owner, should they be interested in an easement or selling their property, it would be valued commensurate with its mitigation worth, not just its surface worth.
Whether it's agriculture or whatever, because that's one of the things for state procurement, we are limited to the appraised value of the land, not 1 penny more, and sometimes if especially in rural areas, if the highest and best use of the property could be for mitigation purposes, that might put a little more dollars in the pockets of the landowner, which might make them a more willing seller to us.
So something to think about there. And we had talked to some appraisers with in that regard. And I think, that's just not something that at this point in time, they have a good structure for. There's not quite enough of it that's happened in Kentucky to sort of build a foundation for how they would do that exactly. But I think we're right on the impetus of that. So, you know, it might be a good time to sort of push in that direction. Scott mentioned the mineral or severances to the title of a piece of property. Right now in Kentucky, the conservation easement statute pretty much prohibits sort of the claim you can make with conservation easement on a piece of property. You can't limit any severance on or adjacent to your property with a conservation easement, and that's by statute. So that's a very, very limiting statute right there. And is essentially the reason why we don't have more projects in Eastern Kentucky, far Eastern Kentucky, that is. So number 4 on here, I called it the Keystone solution. And this is just sort of a rounding out and kind of where we're, you know, the bulk of what we're talking about is we need to procure mitigation like construction with those accounting and procurement procedures. We feel like, similar to North Carolina, the definition of a performance-based quasi-service procurement methodology that is unique from either of the existing methodologies might be the way to go. So we're looking into that from just reading the statutes and thinking about, you know, what kind of changes could be made that would also be feasible to make, not just pie in the sky, wouldn't it be great kind of a change, but something that is legitimate and very specific that wouldn't necessarily cause, you know, detrimental ripple effect to how the finance cabinet operates, you know, elsewhere in the state.
I mean, we all recognize that credits are unique and don't exist. They're not an F-150 Ford truck. They're not a copier. They're not a building. What we would, and we think that, number one, it's already uniquely recognized in that it's a trusted agency fund. But number two, we think that it is unique enough that it deserves its own procurement methodology, either in 45 or 45A, or exempting us out like the transportation and highways are in KRS 176, 177, and allowing us to do something in KRS 150, 255. We think there is a unique avenue and a unique opportunity to be able to do that.
So the last component of that is, and this is also very important, and it's become sort of, I wouldn't say urgent, but definitely there could be a much greater benefit going forward, is our ability to partner with local governments to transfer properties that we need to buy for mitigation, but aren't necessarily appropriate for the Fish and Wildlife Mission for hunting and fishing per se, but that might make a great park or just generally some other type of public access that isn't, you know, quite as aligned with Fish and Wildlife. But, you know, it'd be nice if we could go forth with an acquisition, even if that was part of a full delivery process. We could accept an acquisition and then worry about the details of its endpoint at a later date without having a lot of rigmarole and turmoil about, you know, are we surplusing that property properly? If we knew as a mitigation property, if it, you know, you had that expectation that it would need to have this, you know, what is its endpoint aspect, and you can figure that out as you go. Because as you can imagine, especially in a full delivery situation where you'd be combining a private vendor in with that, if they found a piece of property that would make a great park for a local government, if we had to figure out a bunch of MOAs on the front end to make that happen 10 to 15 years from now, we might never get started. So, you know, we want to be able to keep things moving, dive on in, get the mitigation done, and then revisit with ease, knowing that the intent on the front end was to have to do that when we got to the end.
We also think that this would be a very good economic development component for urban developing counties that would be able to utilize to develop green space, which could be a marketing tool for them to attract companies and other development to build around. And we also think there is a significant component that would actually allow us to get into urban stream corridors and actually do work, say, for instance, in Beargrass Creek in Jefferson County, or some of the areas in northern Kentucky where there's urban streams that right now they're just not viable for us to do because the long-term maintenance. But by being able to go out and knowing the inability to be able to surplus and turn these over to local county or city governments, we think that could be a really unique opportunity to drive even more mitigation in Kentucky.
Right.
This is Gary Moore. I was going to weigh in with those points exactly. Passive recreation, environmental education, parkland, but all types of opportunity that also drive economic development. So thank you. I was going to make that point. You made it for me.
Right, and your cases that we have in your county are exactly, what brought this to the forefront to the extent that it is. But we have seen it in some other places, so it's certainly something that could be of interest throughout Kentucky. So that's our kind of our bringing it all back together, for now at least. So with that, at this point, I mean, the bulk of what we've got to say is done, but we are, we're at a point now, I think that our time is pretty close. We're down to about 10 or 15 minutes. I'm happy to entertain more questions and discussion. And then it's kind of, what's our next action item? I think we could go ahead and volunteer that, we're in the process of looking at the statutory languages and working with, ourselves and some others on maybe some drafts to that, but we definitely entertain any ideas.
Thoughts, comments.
Yeah, just throw them our way and we can kind of assemble all that and see what cream rises to the top. And hopefully by the next meeting, we'll be able to I don't know that we would necessarily have a draft per se, but certainly we could get into the meat of some aspects or maybe resolve some issues that maybe we've noticed, identify some sticking points at the next meeting. So that will be our action item. In addition to that, we're gonna, like Scott mentioned, we'd like to hear from Catherine, if you wanted to be, kind of as the mitigation bank representative, give us that perspective at the next meeting. I mean, that would be great. I don't expect you don't have to take a long time for sure.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, be happy to. Be happy to present sort of from the perspective of what are the enabling conditions that would help mitigation bankers bring even more supply online, and in turn, how does that interact and relate to FILO as well? Yep, happy to.
Yeah, and we'd also like to hear, I see John's on from the chamber, we'd like to hear what the chamber's perspective from an economic development about, again, outside of FILO. We know what an in lieu fee program is, and an in lieu fee program operates post-impact. And we're there as the insurance policy when there is no bank in the area ready to go. And I know we've heard from Northern Kentucky in particular, one of the marketing things is we're already open for business. So what can be done to incentivize or in certain areas and say, hey, we got all these credits ready to go. They're on the shelf. All we need you to do is come in and get them. So we'd really like to hear, again, what can be done holistically from a mitigation restoration perspective, just outside of FILO. What tax incentives could be out there? What can be done with mineral? We'd like to hear from other entities in this work group as well.
That sounds good. I'll get with Kate and yeah, we'll give you some feedback next time around.
Good.
Great. And so just so you guys know, we're looking at the week of December 6 to 10 for the next meeting date. It's a slightly shorter time than we took between meetings this last time, but I think with the holidays, that's kind of hitting a sweet spot between Thanksgiving and Christmas time where a lot of people be out, where it may fit our schedules a little better. So that I'll try to, reach out to folks on times in that week. So maybe pencil that in as a possibility. And I think from there, I mean, we'll definitely be looking forward to, based on what we presented today, maybe talk a little bit the next meeting about how we see, the next legislative session, if we can get something presented in accordance to what we've talked about. So really fleshing that out so that we can start to really create something that people can chew on and hopefully not have any objection to. I think in the right way, this is a good thing that it doesn't have a lot of bias or partisanship. It's a benefit to all of Kentucky. So at least that's the way we're looking at it. So with that, are there any other questions or anything anyone would like to discuss or offer up for the next meeting? Nothing? Okay, I lost.
Going once.
Yeah.
Going twice.
It all sounds great, guys. Thank you so much.
Okay, I appreciate everyone that was able to get on today. And again, sorry about the late start and the snafu with the live stream. I'll do my best to get that up, what we recorded. If there's any link that's different than what I've already given you, I'll make sure and get that. But keep your eyes peeled and stay tuned for that, and maybe an outreach about our next pinning down the time for the next meeting. So thanks again to everyone, and I hope everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Yeah, and please don't feel free that the only time you have to communicate with Rob or I is through the work group. We're available anytime, either via email, phone call, whatever. We'd like to hear different perspectives. I mean, I think the more diverse opinions we have can lead to some viable, productive thoughts, and especially, you guys that deal with this on a national level, it might not work in North Carolina, but it might work in Nevada, or it might work in Illinois, or something that you've seen that might be similar to what we're dealing with. And being able, we're committed to working toward viable solutions and trying to make this an even better program than it already is.
Certainly. So again, I appreciate it. And sorry, somebody had something?
No, I was just saying thanks. It's
Sure.
a good presentation.
Thank you all, and thank you to Tim for joining us and giving us a very, very helpful insight.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
guys.
All right. Thank you all. We'll see you next time.
Sounds great. Bye-bye.